I want to talk a little bit about a couple of things I didn't have a chance to talk about in the module. And one is I really neglected to talk about why classification is important. Why do we take a evolutionary view of our classification? And I think there's a couple of reasons for it. I mean, intuitively, we have a feeling for establishing relationships, and also it's a fundamental question that people have. What is it? What is that thing? What am I looking at? And so I just want to tell a brief story, about myself and my daughters. My daughters were really young. We went to the San Diego Zoo, and we were in that children's section there. And my youngest daughter was maybe 2.5 or 3. She was quite young. My oldest daughter was, around 5 or 6. Anyway, we went to an exhibit, and there was an animal in it. And my youngest daughter was at that age where she's questioning all the time. And she said, what's that? And I said, that's a serval. She said, what's that? I said, a serval. What's that? So this word here, I said, I showed her the sign. This word says serval, and it's describing that animal. So that animal is the serval. She said, what's that? And so now I'm looking at my 2 daughters. They're looking at me. And then my oldest daughter said, Daddy, she means, what is it? Which didn't help me much. So now I'm looking at them. They're looking at me. And I finally said, it's a type of cat. And they go, oh, okay. And so then they were ready to move on to the next exhibit. So they weren't asking me to stick a name on the animal. What they were trying to ask me to do was, what's it like? What's it related to? That's really what they were asking. What is it related to? So again, in classification, we're not just sticking names on things. What we want to try to do is establish relationships and evolutionary relationships. And sometimes that's important to do. So for example, if you look at the first antibiotic that was discovered was penicillin, which was derived from a fungus, Penicillium. And so again, it was just an accidental discovery, but once that was discovered, then people wanted to know, well, maybe there are other antibiotics out there in nature. And so they began to look at close relatives to Penicillium to find other antibiotics. And we did find antibiotics. And so again, most of the antibiotics that we use today actually were all derived from related fungi. Okay, now another thing I want to discuss is that there are some quote-unquote things, not really organisms, that can cause disease that I'm sure you've heard about, and I want to briefly discuss those so that you'll have some sense of what they are and understand why I didn't discuss them in our classification scheme. And one of those is prions. A prion is not an organism, it's actually an infectious protein. And there's some people who still have a suspicion that perhaps this ultimately traces back to a virus, but for now, the way we understand how these work is that they are truly infectious prions, or excuse me, infectious proteins. And so the way that prions work is that there will be a normal state of a protein and an abnormal state of the protein, which I'll represent here with this yellow one. And what's interesting is that the abnormal and normal proteins have exactly the same amino acid sequence. But and normally we look at amino acid sequences translating to protein shape and function and so on. But when proteins fold up into a shape, they sometimes need help in folding up into the appropriate shape. They need what we call chaperones. And a lot of times the chaperone will be another protein of the same type. Anyway, with prions, there are the normal forms of the protein and then these abnormal forms. And so what the abnormal form does is that when it associates with a normal protein is that it will cause it to refold into the abnormal shape. And then over time, they associate with other normal proteins and cause them to fold up in an abnormal shape. Additionally then, these prion proteins typically are not very soluble in the cytoplasm. They'll form clusters that are known as plaques. And then these plaques then are associated with cell death, the death of the neuron. And so the neurons will die, the nerve cells will die. And again, these are typically associated with the nerve tissue. And then ultimately, then this leads to what's known as a spongiform encephalopathy, which is a real mouthful, but basically what it's saying is spongiform is telling you that basically you're going to have holes in your brain. A pathology of the brain that causes a spongy brain is what this eventually causes. So basically you eat holes in your brain, or it does. So again, as we look at different types of prion diseases, one is scrapie, which is found in sheep. Mad cow disease, also called bovine spongiform encephalopathy, is a prion disease that we find in cattle. Chronic wasting disease we find in elk, deer, and probably moose as well. And then Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is the human version of this disease. And so it's thought that this prion sequence started in sheep, jumped to cows, as well as other ungulates in nature, and has infected humans as well. And then last but not least, I also want to mention viruses very briefly. So viruses we've talked about, viruses basically inject genetic material into a cell, take over the cell function to produce new viruses, and eventually the cell ruptures and releases the viruses to infect new cells. And we don't really consider viruses to be organisms. They have some characteristics of life, but not all characteristics of life. For example, they can't take in and modify energy. They don't really grow themselves. They basically take over the machinery of other cells. So they are not really considered living things. But there is a whole taxonomy of viruses. They're certainly biological, but it's just beyond the scope of this class to get into that. But I do want you to know that viruses are in that kind of netherworld. They're not true organisms, but they certainly are derived from biology. They do reproduce, but they don't reproduce themselves. They cause disease, and they do have a classification scheme all their own, but it's just not something that we're going to get into.